What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. I'll be doing the same style video as yesterday, going over your most commonly asked about wide receivers and giving my take on the rest of season value. Before we do that though, have to start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was who is the running back one in half PPR scoring over the last 3 weeks, and the answer is actually Antonio Gibson. Ethan Schechter was the first to get that one right. Today's stat: Calvin Ridley, Tyreek Hill, DK Metcalf, and Davante Adams rank first through fourth in air yards per game, but who ranks fifth? All right, so the players you asked me to go over today are obviously the Texans wide receiver core, now that Will Fuller is suspended for the rest of the season, Travis Fulgham, DeVante Parker, DJ Chark, and finally, you guys wanted to know, are there any wide receivers we should be avoiding in the fantasy playoffs thanks to their schedule? So, we'll start things off with the Texans wide receiver. In case you haven't heard, Will Fuller has been suspended for 6 games for violating the PED policy. And given that we're in week 13 and we don't exactly expect them to make the playoffs or move far in the playoffs if they magically made it, which they won't, it means the season is over for Will Fuller. Apparently, he took a medication that he thought was going to be okay as he's recovering during the offseason. Turns out it wasn't. Nonetheless, he's going to miss the rest of the season. With Bradley Roby, he was also suspended for 6 games as well. So with Stills being released recently, and with Cobb on the IR and also David Johnson out, that makes their top wide receivers Brandon Cooks, Kiki Cutie, and then absolute garbage behind that. They're probably going to run a lot of 2 tight end sets, and if David Johnson were healthy, I would expect a ton of 2 running back sets. But since they don't have very much talent behind Duke Johnson, they have Procise, but he's not all that good. They can't really run many 2 running back sets, so it's mainly going to be the tight ends, I think. But this is just, no matter what they end up doing, it's a massive blow to the offense. And if we look at Deshaun Watson's splits without Will Fuller, they are very drastic. You know, he takes a massive hit in passing yardage, touchdowns, yards per attempt, fantasy points, like everything. These are not small decreases. He takes a huge hit in all of those areas. And when you only give him Brandon Cooks and QT, I mean, he's really good, talking about Watson, but what's he supposed to do? I mean, if you don't give him anything to utilize, like, he's not going to perform that well. So know that, and know that this isn't basketball as well. So in basketball, when we get a stud that's now out of the lineup, sure, the team might perform worse, they might score fewer points, but a ton of usage is still up for grabs. And so players produce better. In general, it's going to be spread potentially evenly, but sometimes different stars. That's not necessarily going to happen to, say, Brandon Cooks. Like, you don't just take all of Will Fuller's yards and targets and say, well, most of that's going to go to Cooks, a little bit to QT, a little bit to the tight ends, a little bit to the running backs, but we're going to give a good chunk of it to Brandon Cooks. That's not exactly how it works. You know, in football, it can have a much bigger impact if you don't have Will Fuller on the field. They are not going to score as many touchdowns. They're not going to be able to sustain as many drives. And so even if Cooks was going to have a larger share of the offense on a drive, well, if they only go 3 and out, now it's even worse. So if Fuller gets them that first down, maybe now Cooks can have receptions and yardage later in the drive. But if the drive stalls because you don't have any talent to throw to, well, now how good is Cooks? And so don't just think Cooks is going to be just the greatest player ever. And I'm not saying that Will Fuller losing that by himself is going to make this just a horrible offense. But losing Fuller, Stills, Cobb, David Johnson, losing all of that, it might make this a really, really bad offense, especially bad considering who the quarterback is. And also, teams could very well just take Brandon Cooks out of the game because they might look at this and say, well, he's their only talented player, at least in the wide receiver core. Why don't we just scheme everything to take him away, force them to beat us with QT and Akins? Can they even do that? And the answer is probably not. And then you think about it, okay, so how are teams going to play against them now? Well, they're already just completely dreadful defending the run. Well, now teams are going to say, okay, they're not going to score that many points against us, and we're already going to attack them more on the ground anyways. Why wouldn't we just run the ball every play, or at least run the ball at a much higher rate, keep Watson off the field, make them be incredibly efficient against us, and just dominate them on the ground, force them to throw when we get up, keep the ball on the ground, don't turn it over. That's what teams are probably going to do, and again, take Cooks out of the game. And so this is going to be a very, very bad thing for this offense. Yes, it's going to raise the floor and ceiling of Brandon Cooks, but not to the degree that I think a lot of people will imagine. It's pretty minor upgrades in general because of these negative effects. Still going to have that monster ceiling that he has always had, but he's not just like all of a sudden a wide receiver one. You need to know that. It makes Keke Coutee viable, but they've done really weird things with him. Like, he's not a bad player, but they've done everything in their power to just not play him. So maybe that changes post Bill O'Brien, but keep that in mind. He's been on the roster. He's produced pretty well when they've given him looks. They just refuse to play him for whatever reason. So again, maybe that changes, but keep that in mind. Although he is a very, very interesting waiver ad, especially if you lost Fuller. Why not go out and get Coutee? But ultimately, looking at everything, I think this hurts Watson the most. Goes from probably like a mid-range quarterback one to more of a low-end one. He's still Watson. He still has upside with his legs. He still has upside with the remaining pieces on this offense. And so he is always going to be fantasy relevant. He's just not as good as he was before. That's enough about the Texans, though. Let's talk about Travis Fulgham. And Fulgham had 16 receiving yards on 12 targets over the last 2 weeks. And then on Monday night, he gains 16 more yards on 2 targets. You can't play Travis Fulgham anymore, unfortunately. You know, we talked about him a few weeks ago saying, yes, the production has been there, but you have to realize why the production was there. He is not a bad player. I don't want you to think that. He's pretty good. But he was more fantasy viable because of who the Eagles were missing. Miles Sanders, Rager, Ertz, Goddard, Alshon. Like, all those guys missed huge chunks of time. They weren't all necessarily out at the same time each week, but all of them missed big chunks. And so when all you have to throw to is Greg Ward and Travis Fulgham and backup tight ends and backup running backs, you're like, okay, I'll throw to Travis. But now that all those guys are back, now that he is seeing a reduction in his snaps, a reduction in his target share, and the offense is still pretty trash because Wentz is not good, it's a very, very big downgrade. Because before, yes, Wentz is bad, yes, the offense is bad, but if he's getting a ton of targets, he can be inefficient with them and still be good in fantasy. But when we see these targets go down, now he needs to be efficient in an offense that just isn't capable of being efficient. So I do not think you can play him anymore. And honestly, he's perfectly fine to drop because he's going to need all these dudes to get injured again. And it's getting more healthy, the offense, because Ertz is going to come back soon, taking even more targets away from him. And they're going to start working Alshon back more. And Rager's going to get more looks. You don't need to own Travis Fulgham anymore. Next up, we have DeVante Parker. After a pretty mediocre middle chunk of the season, he has back-to-back stat lines of 6 for 61, a touchdown, and then 8 for 119, no touchdowns this last week, which correlates almost perfectly to when Fitz took back over the offense. And actually, we do have a sample here in Week 11 playing the exact same opponent, looking at Tua versus Fitz. So we see Tua, he played the first 3 quarters. Parker had 3 receptions, 18 yards, and a touchdown on 4 targets. Then we see Fitz take over in the last 11 minutes of the fourth quarter, and Parker has 3 for 43 on 5 targets. So right there, we see the volume and the production spike. And then he goes out there in Week 12, and he has the best game of the season. So we see 8 games with Ryan Fitzpatrick as the quarterback for the Dolphins. And Parker's season-long pace in those games, 86 for nearly 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns, which is just shy of 12 fantasy points per game in half PPR. Then Tua, we see him play more than 5 snaps in 4 games. And in those 4 games, Parker's season-long pace is 60 receptions, for under 650 yards and 8 touchdowns for under 9 fantasy points per game. So there's your answer. If you look at the quarterback, that's how you know if you should be starting DeVante Parker. If Tua is the starting quarterback, Parker is much more of like a low-end flex play and someone that we definitely need to look at the matchup for before playing. If it's a great matchup, sure, we can play him. But if it's a really difficult matchup with Tua at quarterback, I don't have a lot of confidence in the weekly upside of Parker. If Fitz is a quarterback, well, now in a good matchup, I think he's almost a must-play as a 2. And even in a tough one, Fitz really, really likes throwing to Parker, and Parker is a really good wide receiver. And so even in a difficult matchup, I think Parker has upside. So look at who the quarterback's going to be that week. Tua starting, pay a little attention to that. Fitz starting, lock him in lineups. Next up, we have DJ Chark, and he has been pretty disappointing up to this point in the season, which is really unfortunate, but he has shown some flashes of what we were expecting going into the season, his weekly ceiling. He has had a multi-touchdown game. He has had 2 games with 12 and 14 targets, and so we've seen the ceiling. He ranks 10th in air yards per game on the season, so he's maintained that sort of upside. The problem is that he is now the wide receiver 33 in points per game, and he missed another game this past week due to an injury. Despite this, though, there is still a chance that he can close the season strong. The rib injury seems relatively minor from what I've been able to read, and he should be able to return this week. His issue is the quarterback play and really the organization. Minshew is healthy, okay? And they're just holding him out very likely in order to tank. They're not the first pick right now, but if the Jets pick up a win, now they're in contention for that. So could they hold Chark out longer than he's actually injured? Maybe. I don't know what's going to happen because it's already really difficult to predict when players will come back from these injuries because we know what the injury is, but we don't know exactly how severe they are at times. But when you also throw in a team that is actively trying to lose, well, that adds a whole layer of complexity because maybe he's healthy enough to go out there and they're like, you know what, DJ, we're going to hold you out one more week to make sure you're healthy, but really we don't want to win this game. We're going to try and win with the players we put out there, but if we put bad players out there, then it's easier for us to look like we're trying to win, but not actually be. So if Minshew and Chark for the rest of the season are ever both active, I like Chark. He's a very good player, a ton of upside. I want him in my lineup. But if Minshew doesn't come back, and obviously if they bench Chark, you can't play him. But if Minshew doesn't come back, it's a much bigger concern. It's someone you definitely need to probably only play in the flex, and it's only play in a decent matchup. I wouldn't be playing him in brutal matchups with absolute garbage at quarterback, but in a good matchup, I think you can go out there and you can play Chark. Remember, look at what this team is doing. If they hold him out for another week, you can't play him. If they keep holding out Minshew, the upside is definitely capped. The last thing we'll go over today are matchups, and those are tough matchups for the fantasy playoffs. As some of you know following the season, there are a few teams that we like to fade top wide receivers against, and that would be any wide receiver facing Ramsey, Tre'Davious White, and Darius Slay when it's not Metcalf, because apparently Metcalf is not a human. We used to be fading any wide receiver 1 against Houston when Roby is active, but we've got another situation now where Roby is inactive because, like I said to start the video, him and Will Fuller both suspended 6 games due to a violation of the PED policy. So we're not fading wide receiver 1s against Houston anymore. It probably now is a very good matchup. Crazy how that happens. You take Roby off the field, they go from a very difficult matchup where we're considering fading dudes to, oh, this is like a top 10 matchup, maybe even top 5 for opposing wide receiver 1s. So Ramsey, White, and Slay are the really tough matchups that we are looking at. So the Rams face the Patriots, the Jets, and the Seahawks in the fantasy playoffs. Myers is the only Patriots wide receiver you should be starting right now. I don't think Ramsey will shadow him. It's certainly possible, so that's a concern, of course. I think that chance goes up if Edelman were playing, because then Myers would play a lot fewer snaps in the slot, and then it would basically be, do the Rams want to just put Ramsey always on the side of Myers, or do they want to just keep him on one side, use him with Bird? It's kind of up to them. I would think that they're not just going to try and take Myers out of the game, but you can't really know. Also, Ramsey doesn't always play in man coverage. He plays a lot of zone coverage. And so if they're moving Myers across the formation because Edelman's not there, he's not going to see Ramsey every play. And so it's a tough matchup. You always downgrade wide receiver ones against the Rams, but it's not necessarily going to mean that he's shadowed the whole game. In week 15, like I said, it's the Jets, but you're not really starting any Jets wide receivers. In week 16, they play the Seahawks, and Ramsey is probably going to shadow Metcalf again. He did hold him to 2 for 28 and no touchdowns. But like I said, Metcalf is definitely not human, and there's a 0% chance you're benching him championship weekend. Obviously, realize that he just had 2 for 28 against Ramsey, and that could happen again, and that would be very disappointing. But this is DK Metcalf. He's having a phenomenal season. He's an absolute freak. You're not benching him. I do not care who they're playing. The Bills, so for Tre'Davious White, they play the Steelers, the Broncos, and the Patriots, which means we actually have 3 matchups of concern here. So we'll see who PFF thinks White is going to guard between Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool for week 14 against the Steelers. I would imagine he would just see snaps against both of them. So both will still have upside because they can just go off in the plays they're not facing White. But it's definitely a downgrade for both of these two, especially in Buffalo. We have to think that White is going to take Judy in week 15. He could take Tim Patrick, but I'd imagine he takes Judy, and so that's a downgrade to Judy. And then we have the Patriots again, so not looking great for Myers, if we're being honest. These are really difficult matchups in the playoffs, especially, like I said, if Edelman's able to return for any of these games, then definitely, Myers is going to have a more difficult time because he can avoid some of these matchups in the slot. Edelman plays the slot, and so if he's bumped out to the outside every play, that's difficult. Finally, the Eagles are going to face the Saints, the Cardinals, and the Cowboys. That's a brutal one for Michael Thomas in week 14 because while Breeze can return in week 14, we're not expecting him to. It's going to be probably week 15 or week 16. So it's a big downgrade for Michael Thomas and a potential that you're not starting him. Hopkins in week 15 will face Slay, and so I'm pretty sure you're still going to be starting Hopkins. I realize that's definitely a downgrade. And then Amari Cooper in the Fantasy Championships faces him. He will be a very difficult fade, but that might actually be the correct call. So to recap, in week 14, tough matchups are Jacoby Myers or Damiere Byrd. Kind of depends on what we think is going to happen there. Claypool and Deontay get a downgrade, and then there's a possibility of benching Michael Thomas. In week 15, it's the Jets wide receivers, Jerry Jeudy and DeAndre Hopkins. And then the Fantasy Championships, it's DK Metcalf, Myers or Byrd again, and then Amari Cooper. So I hope that was helpful for a lot of you. We still have the running back and the wide receiver start sits video for this week. So if you have even more questions on players, it might be answered in those. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.